Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this. Digital gives us all more choice and control. It's creating a world in which we're used to being able to order what we want, when we want it, whether it's from Amazon or from Uber. It allows us to watch what we want when it suits us, thanks to Netflix. We can listen to an almost unlimited supply of music thanks to Spotify and others. Many of the most exciting ideas that I've heard about over the past couple of days are about innovations that people are making with digital technology that extend choice. For example, Aaron Rasmussen's masterclass, I was listening about that. It allows everyone to learn directly from the very best actors, sports stars, writers. What was once privileged insights for the well-connected is now insights that are open to everyone. Now, digital is making this idea of having choice and competition a cultural norm. People expect to have this idea of self-selection and control and choice. This isn't some sort of trivial change just in the way we listen to music. It's having a profound change in the spirit of the age. And it's also going to have, and it's starting to have, a profound change in the relationship between the governed and the governing. It's just that the governing haven't quite always understood this. The problem, as I see it, is that many of the changes that have happened aren't reflected by a political system that just hasn't caught up. It hasn't adapted. Digital means, for example, all kinds of innovations in customer service. But where are the changes in the way that the political process serves the citizen? Now, if we lived in a properly functioning system of democracy, you would expect there to be real competition for our votes, right? Our votes, when we cast them, would give us meaningful control over the making of public policy. That surely is the essence of a properly functioning democratic system. Well, yesterday in Britain there was an election. There was a slightly unexpected result. It caught a lot of the experts out. Now, the ruling party lost about 17 seats. The main opposition gained about 30. Now, look at it another way. How many seats out of the 650 actually changed hands during that election? One party gained 30, another lost 17, some others gained and lost a bit. But almost all of the 650 seats didn't change hands at all. In fact, in 80% of the 650 seats, you could have known who was going to win before a single vote had been cast. In 80% of the seats, there was no contest. There is no competition. Over 40 million adults in my country, the UK, are allowed to vote. But what choice and control does that actually give them over the way that they're governed? I would argue that it doesn't. It's not only the UK that this is a problem. In the United States, they have a problem called gerrymandering. Instead of the politicians, or instead of the voters being able to choose the politicians, in effect, choose the voters when they rig the redistricting of the congressional districts. In many European states, there's a party list system that in effect allows people at the top of parties to choose who gets elected. Even in those few seats in the UK that were properly contested yesterday, on both sides, the candidates had been chosen by sitting members of parliament. In other words, the system's rigged so that politicians are choosing who gets to be a politician. In fact, in 6 out of 10 seats that the Conservative Party was hoping to win, the candidate was already working in politics in Westminster. It is a fixed system. Now, when I was first elected to the House of Commons as a Conservative 12 years ago, I thought that the voters were ultimately in control of the system. When I quit politics as an independent a month ago, I'd come to realize that actually the ordinary voter has very, very little control over the outcomes. Now, many aspects of public policy are made by institutions that are completely immune to the public. The small print within parliaments has often been rewritten. election spending law, the allocation of public funds for political parties. These have all been written by the parties as a way of rigging it for the political parties as the middlemen in the political process. I would argue it's not just the political system that's increasingly rigged. Free market capitalism is morphing, I would say, into a system of crony corporatism. If we had a properly free market system, there would be a correlation between risk and reward. And in some areas there is. But in many areas of the economy, big business basically has a business model that allows it to enjoy a one-way bet. A one-way bet often underpinned by rules and regulation written by government. Now, in Britain, there was a recent survey that looked at the FTSE 350 companies, and it found that the FTSE 350 companies over the last 15 years have by many measures been a pretty poor investment for many investors. But those who ran those companies, those who managed those companies, saw their remuneration growing astronomically. Economic inequality, I would argue, in the United Kingdom, in parts of Europe, in the United States, is increasing. In central London, there is now a very wealthy elite who focus on building swimming pools in the basements of their central London houses. And yet, across the rest of the country, there are millions of people who, under the age of 40, stand almost no realistic chance of ever being able to own their own home. By the way, it's not so much income inequality that's grown. Since 2007, by some measures, income inequality has actually narrowed. Nor is it, I would even argue, globalization. The addition of 900 million additional workers to the global labor force may have reduced the cost of labor, but it's also produced a lot of very cheap goods that have actually raised living standards. No, the real driver of economic inequality is the rise in asset prices. In its sense, we've created an economy where the haves have got rich simply for having stuff, whether it's a house or a hedge fund. Why has this happened? Asset prices have been driven up as deliberate policy by central bankers in most Western states. Think of it as a form of public subsidy for big banks. Now, this combination of an unresponsive political system and economic inequality, I would argue, is helping to make politics pretty volatile, unpredictable. It explains the rise of insurgent movements in Europe, in the UK, in the United States. It also explains the unexpected success of some candidates like Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn. Now, it's easy to dismiss political insurgency. We're often encouraged to see these outside figures as angry populists. It's easy to dismiss those who vote for the angry populists as people who somehow reject modernity. But here's a thought. What if it's modernity that allows this insurgency to happen, that makes it possible? Digital means that new voices, sometimes pretty obnoxious voices, can be heard in a way that they never could in the past. I would say that most important, digital changes expectations. It creates a new set of expectations where self-selection and control become a norm. People want to have control. If you have so much choice as a consumer, you're not going to put up with a political duopoly as a citizen. And that, I think, is at the root of this rise of political outsiderism. Now, the danger is that if we don't realize this, if we don't recognize what's happening, we leave it open to charlatans, to fraudsters, to come along and answer to that mood. Politics, if we do that, will then become a choice between indefensible elites and obnoxious fraudsters. And I think there's a real danger of that happening. So what is to be done? What should we do about it? Well, I'm an optimist. I think that many of the most successful digital innovations are about taking out the middleman. If you look at Uber, if you look at Bitcoin, Airbnb, in politics, we need to take out the middleman. We need to take on the political parties that have rigged the system and put themselves at the center of it and short-circuited many of the checks and balances and constraints that should exist. Now, at this point, someone usually thinks, how can you do politics without political parties? Surely we need political parties. Really? Maybe we do, but I don't think we need them in the form that they exist at the moment. Most political parties are organizations that are tightly controlled from the center, from a top-down small elite, whether it's a small elite in Washington or in Westminster or pretty much any capital city. Parties basically do four things. They aggregate votes, they aggregate money, they bring together the money for campaigning, they aggregate messages, and they aggregate know-how, often data know-how, that you need to win elections. Now, I think we can start to see how digital would allow us to do these things, to do those four functions, and to do them outside the conventional corporate party structures. And we're beginning to get an idea of how this could be done. David Cameron's former advisor, Steve Hilton, went off to California and started an organization called CrowdPAC. It allows online funding. It allows candidates, independents, to go online and to raise often really substantial sums of money from ordinary citizens who share their views and their values. And it frees those candidates from a sense of obligation to vested interests and to lobbyists. Online also allows people to communicate without having to be part of a big corporate party structure with press officers and all the rest of it. I know that campaigners in last year's referendum in the UK created a software system that's available online, VIX, and they used it to, in effect, create a pop-up party that created 12,000 campaigners, activists, that in the space of about 6 weeks delivered 72 million leaflets. A final thought, if I may. If political parties were so vital, so essential to the political process, ask yourself this question. Why is it that some of the most successful, unexpectedly successful political figures of our time, whether you agree with them or not, some of the most successful political figures of our time, Macron in France, Trump in America, and yes, I'd add to that list today, Jeremy Corbyn in the United Kingdom. Why is it that they got to where they did by running against their party? A few years ago, it would have been hard to imagine that you could possibly run a taxi service without owning cars. It would have seemed absurd to say that you could have a room rental service without owning a lot of real estate. It would have seemed daft to say that you could organize payments without owning a bank. I hope that we will shortly see people doing politics without the parties, without the middleman. Public services, ultimately, I think, could be controlled by individual members of the public. And actually, we could envisage a world where you simply don't need that reliance on politicians to decide things the way they do at the moment. I think it will happen. I think the sooner it happens, the better. Politics is something that's done to us by a small elite, and I think that's just simply and increasingly incompatible with the spirit and the expectations of our time. Thank you.